There's a certain kind of pain that makes no sound, not because it isn't real, not because it isn't large, but because somewhere early, somewhere in the years when the body was still learning what the world was, a child discovered that making sound when they were hurting didn't change anything, that the tears didn't bring what they needed, that the words, when they came, either landed wrong or landed in silence or made things somehow worse. And so, the way all intelligent living things adapt to a world that doesn't give them what they reach for, this child learned something new. They learned to go quiet, not all at once, not deliberately. The way water finds its level, gradually, without deciding to, following the path of least resistance until the path became the only path they knew. You would not have been able to tell from the outside that anything was wrong. That was the point. That was the skill. The quiet child who absorbs it inward, who processes it alone, who emerges later looking more or less fine. Teachers called it composure. Adults called it maturity. No one called it what it was. Survival, dressed in silence. Let me tell you about a boy named Daniel. Daniel was the kind of child who noticed everything and said very little. He had a particular stillness about him, the kind that made adults assume he was content, was calm, was okay. And he was, in the particular way that children become okay when the alternative is too costly to consider. When something hurt Daniel, really hurt him, the way things hurt children before they've learned the words for them, he didn't cry, not in front of anyone. He would absorb it in the moment, hold his expression carefully in place, and wait. For the car ride home, for the bedroom door, for the specific quiet of a space no one else was in. Sometimes he would sit very still at the edge of his bed and feel the thing move through him. Not quite tears, not quite words, just the weight of something that had happened and needed somewhere to land. And then, because there was nothing else to do and no one was coming to ask, he would put it down, or try to, or tell himself he had, and walk back out into the rest of the day looking to anyone watching exactly as he had before. His parents called him easy. They were not wrong. They were also not seeing the whole picture. Daniel didn't learn to go quiet from a book. He didn't decide one morning to suppress his emotional responses and practice until it felt natural. He learned it the way children learn everything that shapes them, from the specific texture of his particular world, from the times he'd tried to show the hurt and found the room didn't know what to do with it, from the adult who meant well but flinched slightly, redirected, moved too quickly toward fixing or minimizing or explaining why it wasn't as bad as it felt. From the times the tears had made someone else upset, had created a second problem on top of the first, had somehow made the original wound Daniel's fault for having it at all. He wasn't taught that his pain was unwelcome. He simply noticed with the extraordinary perceptiveness of a child who is paying very close attention that the world was more comfortable when he managed it himself. And so he managed it himself, over and over across months and years until the management became invisible even to him, a reflex so deep it no longer felt like a choice. It simply felt like who he was. The quiet child, the calm one, the one who doesn't make a fuss. Daniel's story is not only Daniel's story, there are more of them than the world knows. More children sitting at the edge of beds in quiet rooms, processing alone something that was never meant to be processed alone. More small people learning, in the particular way survival is always learned, that self-containment is the price of peace. Psychologists who study childhood emotional development specifically those working in the tradition of Allan Schore at UCLA, who has spent decades researching how the right brain regulates emotional experience, have documented what happens when a child cannot access co-regulation, when the people around them are not reliably available to help them process difficult feeling. The child doesn't fail to feel. They learn instead to auto-regulate, to manage the emotional experience entirely alone, inside the body, without external help. The nervous system develops on its own a private circuit for distress, and over time that circuit becomes the default route. The body, as Bessel van der Kolk has written in decades of research on how emotional experience lives in the physical self, does not simply let go of what the mouth never said. The unspoken accumulates, not as memory exactly, more like weather, present, recurring, changing the temperature of things without always announcing why. Daniel carried this without knowing he was carrying it. The specific weight of feelings that had never been given their full expression. The grief that was abbreviated. The hurt that was managed before it was witnessed. The anger that was so thoroughly contained it didn't even feel like anger anymore. Just a certain flatness in situations that should have mattered more than they seemed to. But here is what I want you to hold, because this is the part that Daniel's story was always building toward. The part that most people who grew up going quiet were never given. Hold that, we'll return to it. But first, follow Daniel forward, because the child doesn't stay a child, and the silence doesn't stay in the bedroom. Fast forward, Daniel is now 31, or 38, or 45, still quiet when he's hurting, still the one who says I'm fine with a completeness that closes the door before the other person has finished knocking, still the one who, in moments of conflict or pain or genuine need, goes somewhere inside himself that no one else is invited to, not from coldness, not from indifference, but because the interior has always been the only space that felt reliably safe. The people in his life have learned over years to read the particular quality of his quiet. They know the difference between comfortable silence and the other kind. But they don't always know what to do with the other kind, and neither entirely does Daniel. See, the child who learned to go quiet when hurt becomes, in adulthood, the person who cannot always find the way back out, who sits across from someone who loves them and feels something large moving through them and has no reliable bridge between the feeling and the words, who knows intellectually that asking for help is allowed, and finds when the moment arrives that the knowing doesn't move the tongue, that the silence has a gravity of its own by now, that it closes faster than the intention to speak can open. He doesn't withdraw to punish anyone. He withdraws because the withdrawal has been the safest place he knows since he was 7 years old. And the nervous system, trained across decades in one direction, does not simply change because the external world has changed. The people around Daniel sometimes feel a guilt they can't quite name, not because he has accused them of anything. He never accuses anyone of anything, but the silence, when it comes and holds, carries something in it. The accumulated weight of all the times the hurt went in and nothing came back out. And other people can feel the weight of that even when they cannot see it. That is not a flaw in Daniel. That is the cost of the silence. And no one, not the teachers, not the adults who called him easy, not the people who benefited from his self-containment, ever told him that carrying this cost was not his responsibility alone. And here is what I promised to return to. Carl Jung, who spent his life mapping the architecture of the interior life, had a concept for the accumulated contents of all the experiences we cannot hold in conscious awareness, all the feeling that was too much, too dangerous, too unwelcome to express. He called it the shadow, not in a sinister sense, simply in the sense of what follows us when we walk in the light and refuse to look behind us. The shadow does not disappear because it goes unnamed. It shapes behavior from below the surface. It moves the room temperature. It appears in the body as tension, as flatness, as the inexplicable exhaustion of carrying something you have never been allowed to set down. Daniel's shadow was not anger exactly, not grief exactly. It was something older than those words, the accumulated emotional residue of every hurt that had been managed instead of witnessed, every feeling that had gone in and been quietly contained before it could become inconvenient. This is the part that reframes everything. The shadow is not the enemy. The silence was not weakness. Here is the paradox at the center of Daniel's story. The one most children who grew up going quiet were never told, and the one that changes how you see everything that came before it. The child who learned to go quiet when hurting developed something that most people who grew up emotionally loud never had to build: an inner life of extraordinary depth, a capacity for self-containment that, in the right circumstances, is one of the most powerful and stabilizing qualities a person can carry. An ability to sit with difficulty without shattering, to hold pain with a steadiness that the world in its noisier moments genuinely needs. And more than this, the precision with which a child like Daniel came to know his own interior world, the way he learned to notice the fine-grained texture of his own emotional experience because he had to, because no one else was mapping it with him. That precision becomes, in adulthood, a rare and genuine gift. The capacity to understand what others are feeling before they say it, to read the unspoken thing in a room, to sit with someone else's pain without immediately trying to make it stop, because sitting with pain is something Daniel has been doing, alone and in silence, his entire life. He didn't just survive the quiet, he built something inside it. But here is also what is true. The same silence that built something also enclosed something. The shadow of unspoken hurt does not dissolve on its own. The body, as the research shows us, keeps the record with a faithfulness that the conscious mind would sometimes prefer it didn't. And the person who learned to manage everything alone eventually encounters what all forms of self-sufficiency eventually encounter: its own limit, the moment where the management becomes heavier than the original wound, where the going quiet stops being adaptive and begins being isolating, where the person who never asks is not fine. They are simply too practiced at appearing fine to know how to stop. Jung called the path forward individuation, not the elimination of the shadow, its integration, the slow, imperfect, genuinely difficult work of bringing what was hidden back into the light. Not all at once, not with force, but with the kind of patient attention that the child inside Daniel always deserved and rarely received. It does not mean becoming someone who announces their pain at full volume. It means learning, slowly, in the specific increments that feel survivable, that the silence can have a door in it, that the hurt, when it arrives, can sometimes be spoken instead of stored, that the person on the other side of the conversation might be capable of holding it, That asking is not burdening. That needing is not weakness. That the interior world, built with such care across all those years of quiet, can be shared with another person without being diminished. The nervous system is not fixed. Neuroscience tells us this with an increasing certainty that carries something like hope. The pathways built through years of self-containment, the automatic routes that close before the hurt can surface, are not the only routes available. They are not permanent. New patterns of response can be developed alongside the old ones, not replacing them, not erasing what the silence built, but offering an alternative, a different possible response in the moment when something hurts and the old familiar quiet begins to close in. And perhaps it begins with something very small. Perhaps it begins with noticing the moment the quiet arrives, not judging it, not forcing it open, but simply noticing it, naming it internally. I am going quiet, something hurt, and I am going quiet. Perhaps it begins with one small act of saying the true thing to one person who has earned the right to hear it. Not perfectly, not all of it. Just one sentence, the one that has been sitting at the edge of language, waiting longer than you may remember. That is enough. That is, for someone who has gone quiet since childhood, more than enough. That is everything. If you recognize yourself somewhere in Daniel's story, if some part of what I have described sounds less like a description and more like a memory, then hear this. The silence you learned was not a flaw in you. It was a response to a world that was not always equipped to receive what you were carrying. You adapted with the intelligence and resourcefulness of a child who was doing the best available thing with what was available. You built something, a depth, a patience, a capacity for interior life that belongs to you entirely, and that nothing about this conversation asks you to abandon. But you are also allowed to let it breathe now. You are allowed to say it hurts out loud to another person without immediately qualifying or minimizing or closing the door before the sentence is finished. You are allowed to stop being the one who manages it alone. You are allowed to be witnessed. Because the child who went quiet when they were hurting was not quiet because the pain was small. They were quiet because no one taught them that the pain was worth voicing, that their interior world was worth entering, that they, specifically, not a more composed version of them, not a less inconvenient version of them, were worth the full attention of another person who would simply stay. You were always worth that. The silence was the answer a child gave when no one asked the question. You are allowed now to live as if someone finally did.